Hello folks, finally I'm back with another video, and I wanted to start off with an easier one after a little bit of a break, having to do work on my assignments for university, and also working a full-time job and stuff. And it was not necessarily easy to find the motivation to keep going with this channel. I mean, I guess it's grown since it first started out, but still, it's something you got to keep at, something you got to consistently think about in order to come up with new ideas and to put out new content out there. So this one is just going to be me sharing another paper of mine. What makes it easy about it is the paper's already written. I just got to read about it, or read off of it. So I'm not going to be just hitting record and winging it, which I'm sort of doing right now, but this is just the introduction to the paper. And this paper is about the character and the maxim that I live my life by, and the one that I try to transmit to those younger than me, and also my sort of realizations about the world and in my quarter of a century of life that I've seen so far, and what could really be the underlying reality causing that to be the case. So hopefully you enjoy it, and let us proceed. Okay, here it is. So the title is Quest for Sincerity and the Skeptic's Maxim, written earlier this year, or I should say last year now. Alright, here I start. Words are simply a combination of phonetic sounds. In some aspect, they are quite arbitrary, but through repetition they become instilled in the mind as denoting certain ideas or objects. But even apart from that, different languages would obviously put together a different combination. Different languages would obviously put together a different combination of phonetic sounds, but that is only if they do so at all, because it could easily be the case for some of them having encompassed a wider scope of references or meaning, or perhaps may have been left omitted in a lingual characterization altogether. With that in mind, we should proceed to consider the two virtues I would like to focus on, of which one I get to idealize in its most perfect form, and intending to make that my path of pursuit and striving to be a better man. The present and the ideal. To observe the situation best, one must place themselves in the shoes of another, as an encouragement often made in regards to assessing a situation. Perhaps this would be the virtue of being considerate or being circumspect. I would like to choose that as one virtue, along with skepticism, which may be an odd choice and not even immediately obvious as being a virtue. But if you were to scale it up in the manner of Aristotle's ethical approach, perhaps being cynical could be its deficient form, and being gullible its access. So in that sense, this moderate and general approach to life, as one seeks sincerity and truth, cannot be a vice, but surely one that could benefit greatly the pursuant. It is not necessarily a virtue to tout about oneself an ability or a praise, but that is what this assignment specifically asks to do. But how effectively do I practice the virtues I may claim to have? This can really be assessed perhaps by others who observe my habits, or an omniscient entity if we are to admit that concept. But I can probably claim that there are certainly virtues to which I intend to strive towards in my daily life, and consistency is to be fulfilled when one's action is to align with their intent. But through commitment and persistence, virtues which would translate to deeds could eventually be habituated into the life of an individual. And whenever that a particular circumstance is to be encountered by that individual, their instinct would have accumulated the senses which to best assess and proceed with an act that most appropriately or correctly adheres to the virtues to which they strive. Putting oneself in another's shoes is a mode of consideration or assessment that I try to utilize as much as possible. And hopefully with frequency and repetition, it comes to be second nature. As in the case when a footballer aims for a dip in his free kicks, or when a wrestler perfects his double leg takedown in a similar manner. Whether the mind can be trained like the body through repetition is perhaps a moot point, but this comparison is made simply to extrapolate the process by which one's improvement may transpire. Now, when it comes to cynicism, which I have chosen as a single defective vice for the purpose of this assignment, though as any other mortal, my vices too are likely numerous, but let's grant it that it shall be the Almighty to hold final judgment. But before proceeding, let me try to define exactly what I mean by such an adjective as it applies to myself, because again, we must not forget the words are merely arbitrary combinations of phonetic sounds, or maybe even perhaps that I may have mistaken and could have chosen a better suiting word altogether. But the paramount concern of a cynic, as I describe it, is the absence of sincerity in the demeanor of others, and the related observation that this is more so the common deficiency in the conduct of many, if not most, and consequently culture or tradition necessarily having to reflect what was practiced not by the few but by the most. Thus all the various rites of courtesy and etiquette, as expressed verbally and physically by members of various cultures, is anything but sincere. This is in an honest sense my line of reasoning for being nonconformist, but even more assertively an iconoclast. Let me just take a sip of water here. The threshold of conviction. In a discussion, rather than an argument with my father recently, he made the point concerning some news headline that because I'm no more a kid, I should be able to understand the severity of the situation due to maturation. But exactly according to that factor of maturity, if I can be granted, I've come to different observations about life, certainly different from him, who always had this slight disposition towards paranoia, in that because one is to hear more lies as they are to live more years, hence because of being fooled not once but numerous times, one learns to be more cautious or skeptical. To illustrate this in a different way, consider that everyone has a threshold in which the information they confront amount to an accumulation of evidence, or rather supposed evidence, and once this gradually increasing data has exceeded the threshold of the person, then they finally buy into it because the supposed evidence has come to eclipse their armor of skepticism. Considering that, it may also be agreed that every individual would have their threshold differentially placed, hence one with a low threshold is gullible, and one with a high threshold is skeptical or even cynical. Thus an important difference between me and my father would perhaps be how this threshold stands, or where this threshold stands. And of course we must not regard this as a fixed post that one takes to approach everything, but certainly an apt hypothetical one to illustrate the point here between a skeptic and a naivete, if I'm pronouncing that right, naivete. The traits inherent to character. Next question regards my background, namely, how has my background contributed in me having this sort of a worldview? My earlier comment on culture here is too germane, though just to clear up a possible misunderstanding, I did not mean to imply that all of culture is hollow. Rather, many of its facets may have been truly noble in its origins, but bastardization is a pattern that has always been endemic to the human race. To elaborate the point then, perhaps there had been certain noble ideal or reason in which emerged a tradition, but as it persisted through generations and people continued to practice it, but they did so merely mechanically, it was thus rendered vacuous. That is, the kernel had long been missing. But there's another point to consider. I do not necessarily buy into the idea of tabula rasa, at least as it implies a disregard for the original aspect of our individuality as opposed to the nurtured one. In that case, a person would be nothing except what he is exposed to. That is to say, there is nothing inherent in the person except for what is later acquired or adopted through the years of his life. I would disagree, and for the reader to heed my objection, he would have to concede the idea of a soul. Surely, at least for those who believe in an afterlife, that is the persistence of consciousness after the demise of the body, they ought to also consider if that consciousness had possibly existed prior to their birth, because copulation can only amount to a conception of an embryo, as can any other mammal. But surely souls are not created in such a way, because conception in that sense describes a physical process, while consciousness is undoubtedly immaterial in essence. So that granted, we can conclude that a soul is not created by copulation, but that only a fetus thereby comes to be, which at some point a soul may come to inhabit the body. So if we do in fact have souls, it must exist both in advance and subsequent to one's life in this temporal realm. That is itself the first point to digest. Consider the second one. Every individual has a soul, a particular soul, but can we be sure of that? Not necessarily. For example, we can point to the several avatars of the Hindu deity Vishnu. Hence, if every one of these various incarnates emanate from a single source, why should we then assume ourselves to have one peculiar kind that is unshared with others? This consideration makes one wonder if the world population really equals the total number of souls, or simply that some handful of sources come to be made manifest in a myriad of bodies. And if we were also to consider that each soul, as does each body, has its own particular set of features, then this simply means that each individual has characteristic features that is unique to them and cannot necessarily be altered by society. That is to say that everyone has certain set of traits in their character, and they may not even be ones they got in common with their relatives, since kinship may have no significance in the world beyond. And so they are features belonging to the soul even prior to the admission into this world. So considering the conclusions of the thought experiment, am I to assume that my background was a factor in molding my worldview? I would have to say yes, but only partially. It is not absolutely certain that I would have to come to be the same person if I was born into a different family or raised in a different society, but I would like to think that I possess traits that are peculiar though not exclusive to me, and as a result of those traits being ingrained upon my consciousness, I may have adopted a pattern of life that reminisces with the hypothetical alternative circumstances of my upbringing. Alright, quick water sip. The Skeptic's Maxim. Rather than typing up a pretend interview, as I'm sure many of my classmates cleverly would, I should intend to elaborate on how the skeptical mind would go about encountering new information. Certainly the threshold of supposed evidence mentioned is too here pertinent, but here we shall expand on the skeptic's ratiocination with the maxim, always question authority. An authority in this context is utilized in a rather broad way, but specifically, government, tradition, and family could make up its components. Whether we regard the state as an entity that competes with individuals' liberty, or an entity that, unlike others, have to gain their livelihood through peaceful and voluntary cooperation, but does so through coercion, or an entity that holds a monopoly on violence. However it may be described, it is an entity of authority, and that fact alone suffices for the maxim to apply. When it comes to etiquette, rites, or patterns of tradition, most follow it simply because that is what everyone else around them seems to do and have done for many generations. But why do it? Simply because it has been done for so long. This amounts to blind conformity. If one commits to doing something just because everyone else does them, apply then reductio ad absurdum. If everyone jumps off a roof, then I shall proceed to follow. But the organization of various cultural elements is usually concentrated within religion, and everybody for most of human history, wherever on earth they happen to be born, religion was imposed on them. And through years of indoctrination, that innocent child can then come to be a zealous religionist who confidently and undoubtingly believes that his particular religion is the true religion. What are the odds that an individual who could have been born into any random religion in the world was born into the only true one? But this sort of reasoning never crosses such a person's mind. Simply put, conformity in such a degree results in the dilapidation of the rational capacity. So while the state holds a monopoly on power, as we have said, religions then claim that they hold a monopoly on the truth. While the former may be verified by you trying to practice your individual liberty in a way that is unsanctioned by the regime, and will deem as an infraction of the code of conduct that it imposes on its subjects, which is usually wrongly referred to as the law, the latter surely lacks any such verifiable certainty, as is made up of merely transcriptions and oratories that have been transmitted through many generations, and one needs to have a great deal of faith to maintain that the supposed God's word had descended undefiled through so many millenniums. But surely, since religion or other cultural institutions hold authority and expects its members to conform, which it may do so through exhortation or even at times compulsion, the maxim again applies, and that is by the mere fact that it holds an authoritative position in society. I may be mistaken, but it sure seems like the Homo sapien invests a whole lot more time and attention to the upbringing of its offspring in comparison to other creatures. A doe seems to leave its fawn only after a year. A turtle seems to bury its eggs in a beach and be gone. But for humans, their offspring seems to remain with them through its childhood, adolescence, and even sometimes into adulthood. It is true that parenting is not an easy job. It is a huge responsibility. But it does certainly seem, after brief inspection, that there are a whole lot of parents who seemingly lack the competence. Since they can barely yet take care of themselves, they have yet hastened to beget children. A scene of this sort can easily be seen in a high school of the shady sort. But one simply can conclude from this that the Almighty seems to have made conception of a child a little too easy an effort, that even one who has not given a moment's thought to the responsibility or complexity of parenthood can become one themselves by means of a single event. For the soul that is to be inserted at some point into the fetus that's to be conceived by the mere act of copulation, you feel sorry for the soul and the simple fact that some incompetent individuals are now engaged in summoning this consciousness by their mere act, which they perform to really only satiate their carnal desires. But there's a more important point here to be made, and it is that the soul may have never actually had a choice in being born to these parents, or in being born at all. Yet when they are born, they are expected to love life and hold reverence and gratefulness towards their parents because they may have bothered to feed, clothe, and nurture them, but yet as if the soul at any point had actually agreed to any such arrangement. Forget the social contract between a state and its subjects. How about the contract between parents and their children, i.e., summoned souls? Yet nonetheless, parents hold authority over their children, but depending on the child, perhaps on the account of their inherent characteristic traits. Some come to be the rebellious kind, and then there's of course the obedient kind, and a gradation between them too. Let us describe the obedient kind as being an individual that never questions the validity of what their parents utter. This is again falling into the pattern of conformity, as has been noted in the behavior of both the political and the religious partisan. Of course, Aristotle would suggest the golden mean, and that is probably the right choice even in this context. But what is most important for the child or the individual in general, in all these cases, is to realize that humans are mortals. But this is not to invoke the case of their temporality, but rather their imperfection in essence, thereby the corollary being that perfection in essence would be properly ascribed only to divinity. This fact is very important for the citizen to consider when perceiving its rulers, for the layman to consider when perceiving the supposed holy figures of present and past, and also for the child to consider when perceiving its parents. The obedient kid fails to take this into perspective, or the obedient kid fails to take this perspective. And in this sense, the child was been left in an unfortunate situation, either by the split of his parents or some sort of misdemeanor by them to which he had come to witness. This gives him an opportunity at an early age to come to the realization that parents are no angels, and that they are blemished by many flaws, as is characteristic of humans in general. The ideal skeptic then would live true to this maxim. He would have intended for no less than consistency, as is humanly possible, by trying to align his actions correctly with his reasons. He may have born into a family of a certain class, to a culture of certain richness, or to a jurisdiction of a certain state. But he, the truth-seeker, as should be his defining pursuit, shall strive to transcend all these arbitrary inheritances and seek laws, axioms, and virtues that are universal by principle. Thus, individuals are not somehow to be considered extraordinarily special due to mere kinship. The rite and formalities are not to be adhered for the mere sake of conformity to the blind patterns in which everyone else finds himself. And some legislation is not to be perceived as a determinant of one's conscience, as if it was a divine decree. Rather, the ideal skeptic would realize that the human element is a component in the making of all these patterns and institutions. In fact, that is what makes them all alike, and the human or mortal element refers again to the inherent fallibility to thereby imply the great possibility for adulteration. Alright, we continue here. The cynic's diagnosis. Cynical is what I have claimed to be, and skeptical what I have designated as my target for the purpose of this assignment. But surely we must not forget that these are somewhat arbitrary combinations of phonetic sounds, and they may even lack exact correlates when sought in different languages, as is the case with many words. So we are going to have to flesh out my deficiency and intended goal in a somewhat similar manner of contemplation and thought experiments. As a result of which I seek to identify the flaws which persist in my personhood and also the potential solutions to resolve those deficiencies, my elaboration, though, may at times seem like a justification of my quirks or habits, because I would like to think that I abide by certain rules or patterns, because reasons have sufficed to convince me that this is the most adequate way to approach or encounter this or that aspect of life. But spelling out my reasoning may also help me in pointing out and finally making apparent the inconsistencies in my reasoning, as solving a problem surely first starts with identifying the problem. So what exactly caused me to become a cynical individual? I could probably confidently single it down to the factor of sincerity. The realization that I've come to as a young adult, and perhaps many individuals come to in a similar point in their life, is that sincerity is precious. That is perhaps an elegant way to put it, but basically, sincerity is in a state of dearth or paucity, and this to me seems like reality, and everything else we have socially devised is simply to embellish and adorn this rather poignant state of affairs. But sincerity for me has also come to imply a metaphysical significance in some way. That is, my quest for knowledge and wisdom has also rendered sincerity as being somewhat adjacent in its proximity. Or to put it another way, the trajectory that calls the righteous by the way of his virtue or deeds, and the curious by the way of his perseverance for knowledge, seems to be the same one where sincerity lies. Piety, then, in this sense, amounts to traversing both spiritually and intellectually to a closer relationship with divinity, which when the arduous journey has been undergone victoriously, this could be termed as apotheosis. It may then become understandable the situation of the world as we find it, that what we may regard as sincerity and its modicum presence in our realm connotes a general deficiency of a greater sort, which duelists of a certain kind may regard as a trumping of the chthonic forces over the divine forces. This discovery I have just made in the course of writing this paper then comes to elucidate my earlier conclusions, and sort of points in the direction of the underlying cause of the world as we find it, as so different from the one we once knew as a child. That is, elements have come to intermingle, and increasingly so, in the complexities of adult life, and happen so even biologically, as we come to be defiled in our individual purity, as we start to develop such deleterious passions as lust and temptations, which start to evince more and more of the base elements in our human composition. Trajectory. There's no recipe in the making of a virtuous man, but there are certainly many guideposts that one encounters throughout their life, and the person with sincere intent will look to acquire the wisdom that this book, that person, or this event has to offer. In other words, the gems of wisdom there lie for the taking. The seeker, though, must search with an open mind, as some, if not many, can be found in places least expected. But along with the accumulation of such profound insight, if one does not intend to observe these findings in their action, their negligence as such could amount to hypocrisy. Thus, whatever one knows, without the effort thereby to apply these findings, the virtue in thought fails to equal virtue in deed. But surely the redirection of a ship by a slight degree would result in its sailing in waves far away from the original direction, and likewise in a man's life. Days amount to a month, months amount to a year, and in time will one's efforts come to be visibly expressed as they increasingly start to resemble the person who they had intended to become. Self-reflection, which some regard as the distinctive human future, would also come to be quite useful if used to assess one's progress and identify one's error. But this capacity amounts to much more, namely introspection. One could seek then for these gems not just in the world that we perceive with our eyes, but also perhaps in the world within, which we can perceive with our mind. And there one comes to witness the dynamic assembly in which all ruminations and cogitations transpire, as ideas shall seek to persuade the throne from where the rightful monarch, reason, shall reign. All right. There is that, a dozen pages. Hopefully, you're able to find at least some of it interesting, valuable, something to consider, and most importantly, perhaps this is to try and convey or offer food for thought. Something to consider, something to perhaps muse about. If I was able to do that, perhaps it's attained its objective. Because even though this is a paper written for a university assignment, regardless of the grade, which was a failing grade, but this is one of my best written papers, and it's obviously not written in the standard form, because there's no thesis, there's none of that formatting. It's just like my sort of free flow, the freestyle approach to writing papers. But regardless of the grade that it ended up getting, I'm proud of this work, and as I'm reading through it, I may find errors here and there, but for the most part, I wouldn't change much. And hopefully you guys enjoyed it. Hopefully there was something to be taken away. And I've written other papers too, and since my major is in politics, that's what most of them would be focused on. This was just one course, the philosophy course that I had taken as an elective. So, and I just went on to share some of my own exercises of philosophizing and such, which sort of defies the conventional forms of philosophy. Because the impression I got from the philosophy department at universities is different than the one I expected, but whatever. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Like, share, subscribe.